He turned down a guaranteed hit and walked away from millions of dollars. And the industry never quite understood why. For 30 years, Michael Keaton let people assume it was about ego or money or simply growing tired of the cape. That decision, and the one that came 30 years later when Warner Brothers handed him back the cowl and then quietly wrote his version of the character out of existence, are really the same story, told twice. It is the story of a man who has never once performed loyalty to a costume for its own sake, only to the person he found underneath it. At 74, he has finally said it plainly. Michael John Douglas was born the 5th of September 1951 in Coriolanus, Pennsylvania, the fifth of 7 children. His father was a civil servant. His mother raised the family in a working-class suburb of Pittsburgh. He started doing stand-up and small comedy parts around Pittsburgh in his early 20s, under the name Keaton, adopted simply because the Screen Actors Guild already had a Michael Douglas on its rolls and required something unique. He drove a taxicab. He worked in a film equipment warehouse. He was, by his own description, a guy who made his family laugh and thought that might translate into something. It translated into Night Shift in 1982, a film Ron Howard had nearly been pulled off before it even started shooting. The studio wasn't convinced by what they'd seen in the auditions, and it took Howard and a young producer named Brian Gracer fighting for the casting to make it happen at all. Keaton has said plainly that he was almost fired from more than one early project, that there was always somebody somewhere who wasn't sure about it. Night Shift did well enough to keep him working. Then came Mr. Mom in 1983, a John Hughes script about gender roles and economic anxiety that made him laugh so hard reading it in bed that his head hit the headboard. He and his manager, Harry Coley, ended up rewriting large sections of it themselves because Hughes delivered the draft and then largely disappeared from the process. Keaton has said the movie was ahead of its time. Nobody in 1983 was really talking about a husband staying home while his wife went to work. And looking back, he's probably right. It made him a name, but it was 1,988's clean and sober that showed what he was actually capable of underneath the comedy. He played a cocaine addict, a man who lies about everything and knows it and cannot stop. And the performance worked because Keaton found the thing underneath the addiction rather than simply performing the addiction itself. His method, as he has described it, was always the same question. Where's the cheese? What does this man wake up needing? He talked to real addicts. He located the smallest obsessive thread in his own personality and followed it outward until it became someone else entirely. The character was unpleasant and completely believable, and people who saw the film understood that something was happening here that had nothing to do with the guy from Mr. Mom. Then Tim Burton called about Batman. The announcement when it landed in 1988 set off a response that by the standards of pre- and popular culture was extraordinary in its intensity. 50,000 protest letters arrived at Warner Brothers. The logic of the outrage was simple, and on its own terms, coherent. Keaton was the comedy guy. Keaton was Mr. Mom. Keaton was not Batman. The studio was rattled enough to raise the issue with Burton directly more than once. Burton held firm because he had worked with Keaton the year before on Beetlejuice and had seen something the letter writers couldn't see from the outside. A strangeness, an off-center interior intensity, the quality of a man who didn't quite fit any obvious category and never had. Batman, Burton understood, was not supposed to be a cool person. He was a man whose parents had been murdered in front of him at 8 years old, who had organized the whole of his adult life around that single night. That is not a glamorous figure. That is an odd, obsessive, deeply lonely one. Burton was right that Keaton could find him. Keaton has described building the role the way he builds everything from the inside out, starting with the person rather than the costume. He never thought about Batman. He thought about Bruce Wayne. Who is this man? What happened to him? That's where you start. Not the cape, the boy in the alley. He and Burton agreed early that Bruce Wayne should be odd rather than suave. A man who had probably never set foot in half the rooms of his own mansion because his actual life was happening somewhere else entirely. There is a moment in the finished film where Keaton's Bruce Wayne tells Vicky Vale he doesn't think he's ever been in the room they're standing in. The line wasn't scripted. Keaton improvised it on set because it felt true to the man he had built. Someone so consumed by the life he kept secret that the ordinary details of the life he was supposed to be living simply went unattended. the suit nearly became its own separate problem. Keaton arrived for production, convinced he needed to get into extraordinary physical shape to fill it out properly. He was working the heavy bag one afternoon when Jack Nicholson, who was playing the Joker, walked past. Nicholson looked at him and asked what he was doing. Keaton said he was working out. Nicholson asked, "What for?" and walked away without waiting for an answer. Keaton stood there, stopped sweating, and understood immediately that he had no real response. He has told that story for decades because the lesson stuck permanently. The suit does most of the work on its own. You don't need to fill it out. You need to understand what it means to put it on. It would take him another 30 years, and a second costume fitting to fully act on the advice. When he came back for the Flash, he found that being smaller and leaner inside the suit gave him more room to move, more room to breathe, and he has said he has no idea why it took him that long to figure out something Jack Nicholson told him for free in 1989. Batman opened in June 1989 and earned over $400 million worldwide against a budget a fraction of that size. One of the biggest films Warner Brothers had ever released. It also less publicly complicated Keaton's personal life in a way the press would not piece together for years. He had been married to actress Caroline McWills since 1982, and the marriage was already under strain by the time the film's sequel went into casting. Michelle Pfeiffer, who would eventually play Catwoman in Batman Returns, had originally been the producer's first choice for Vicky Vale in the very first film, and Keaton, according to his Batman co-star, Robert Wall, was firmly and explicitly opposed to her casting. The reason had nothing to do with her talent. Keaton and Pfeiffer had briefly dated and broken up while he was still technically married at a moment when he was trying by his own account at the time to repair things with his wife. Having his former partner across from him on a soundstage was not a complication he wanted. The studio went with Kim Basinger instead. Keaton and Mac Williams divorced in 1990. 3 years later, with that chapter closed, he had no objection at all to working alongside Pfeiffer on Batman Returns, where she played Catwoman to his Batman with a chemistry that audiences felt and that very few of them understood the backstory of. Asked years afterward what advice he'd give a young actor about working opposite an ex, Keaton answered in 4 words: be a pro, be a man, and be a grown-up about it. He has more or less lived by that standard since, even when the standard was inconvenient. The sequel, still directed by Burton, paired Pfeiffer's Catwoman with Danny DeVito's Penguin and pushed the visual and emotional register considerably darker and stranger than the original. Batman Returns underperformed relative to its predecessor and drew complaints from family-oriented retailers and parent groups about its tone. The studio decided Burton's version of Gotham had gone as far as it was going to go. Joel Schumacher was brought in, and the production moved forward with or without Keaton's participation. Val Kilmer was already a viable alternative, and the offer on the table came with a substantial raise. Keaton read the new script and said no. Not after extended negotiation, not after counteroffers. He read it and knew immediately. He has said simply that he didn't understand why everything suddenly had to be so much lighter, so much campier. He had spent a year discovering exactly how this particular man had become Batman, and the new version wasn't interested in that question at all. It was interested in a different question. One he had no investment in answering. He walked away from the money because the person he had built was no longer in the material. Kilmer took the role. Batman Forever made a great deal of money. Keaton has never suggested he regretted the decision for a single day. What came after did not fit the comeback narrative the industry likes to tell about actors who step away from franchises. He worked steadily through the 1990s. Multiplicity in 1996 required him to play 4 cloned versions of the same character simultaneously. A technical puzzle so demanding that he kept a chart taped to his trailer wall tracking which version of himself was in which scene. A system so specific that when Ben Stiller wandered by one day and asked what he was doing, Keaton pulled him inside to explain it. And Stiller looked at the wall, said nothing, and walked back out. He played Dogberry for Kenneth Branagh in Much Ado About Nothing, inventing a half-Celtic accent on the spot that reportedly made the production's Shakespeare scholar visibly anxious, while Branagh calmly assured the man it would all be fine. By the mid-2000s, though, the work had genuinely slowed, and Keaton has never tried to dress that up as anything other than what it was. He has said plainly that he probably got a little bored, not with acting exactly, but with himself, with the version of his career that people expected him to keep performing. People forget about you when you're not visible, he has said. and he was during those years off doing other things entirely. He bought land in Montana. He learned to do real physical work with his hands again, framing, plumbing, the specific satisfaction of a job a man from Coropolis understands instinctively. He developed a genuine, slightly evangelical enthusiasm for the Sawzall, a reciprocating saw that he has described on national television with more excitement than he typically reserves for discussing his own films. At one point, offering to personally deliver one to a talk show host so the man could understand what he was missing. What he did not talk about publicly for a long time was heavier than any of that. His nephew Michael struggled for years with addiction and died in 2016 at 35 from an accidental overdose involving heroin and fentanyl. When the producers of Dopic approached him years later, a dramatization of America's opioid crisis built from Beth Macy's reporting, Keaton understood immediately why this was the one. He played a small-town doctor whose own choices helped set a chain of destruction in motion, a performance built entirely on the kind of interior understanding he has always worked to find before anything else. The role earned him a Screen Actors Guild Award nomination for Outstanding Performance by a Male Actor in a Drama Series. He did not win. The award that year went to Jeremy Strong for Succession, but Keaton had already said what he came to say. In interviews around the project's release, he spoke about his nephew directly, without flinching from the specifics. "We lost my nephew Michael to drugs," he said. "It hurts." He did not need a trophy to make the point land. Then in 2014 came Birdman, and with it, the role that the industry had been waiting nearly 2 decades for him to play. A man who had once been famous inside a superhero franchise, and was now trying to claw his way back to artistic legitimacy while possibly losing his mind. The parallel to Keaton's own life was so obvious that he addressed it head-on in every interview rather than dodge it. Yes, he saw the connection. No, the character wasn't him. Ryan Thompson was owned by desperation, in a way Keaton insisted he had never been. Restless, occasionally bored, willing to walk away from money and prestige alike, but never desperate. Desperation, he said, was a different animal entirely. The film was constructed to appear as one continuous take, choreographed so precisely that an entire day's filming could collapse if a single person, actor, camera operator, even a bird passing through frame broke the rhythm. When a take actually worked, the crew applauded because everyone understood exactly what had just been accomplished. Keaton received his first Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. He did not win. He has never indicated that the loss cost him any real sleep. Spider-Man: Homecoming followed in 2017, and Keaton has talked about the role of Adrian Toomes, the Vulture, with genuine relish. Toomes was a man who had built something honest, a legitimate salvage operation, and had it taken from him by people with more institutional power, and who responded by working outside the law to provide for his family and his crew. "Where's mine?" the character was really asking. "What about me?" Keaton found that question entirely contemporary and played Toomes as a man with a real grievance, even while doing illegitimate things about it. He has said he loved that set, specifically loved the actors playing his crew. Loved going to work and berating his boys on camera and then getting a beer with them once it wrapped. And then, 30 years after he had walked away from Schumacher's Gotham, the DC Universe came calling again. The plan this time was substantial. Keaton would reprise Bruce Wayne in The Flash, a multiverse film whose central conceit allowed his version of Batman to exist alongside Ben Affleck. If the film performed, his Batman would become the connective thread running through a rebuilt DC slate. The older, wiser presence steering a new generation of heroes, a rough equivalent of what Nick Fury had been for Marvel. He would mentor Leslie Grace's Barbara Gordon in a planned Batgirl film. There was even talk, credibly sourced, of a live-action Batman Beyond, the animated series in which an aging Bruce Wayne hands the mantle to someone younger, which would have been, by any reasonable measure, the role built precisely for the man he had become. He shot all of it. Slipping back into the suit, he has said, felt like riding a bike. The muscle memory returned immediately. The particular stillness the armor imposes on a body. The way that stillness becomes its own kind of authority. He filmed The Flash. He filmed his Batgirl scenes. He believed in the plan enough to give it everything, because giving anything less has never been an option he understood how to choose. Then Warner Brothers changed hands. David Zaslav took over as CEO and Batgirl was canceled in post-production and written off entirely as a tax loss without ever reaching an audience. A decision without real precedent for a film with that level of investment already spent. The ending of The Flash that had been built around Keaton's Batman surviving as the new universe's anchor was scrapped and reshot. The new footage showed his Bruce Wayne dying in the climactic battle instead. James Gunn and Peter Safran arrived to run DC Studios with a mandate to start over completely, and there was no place in their version of things for the character Keaton had spent 2 productions and 30 years building. He received all of it with the particular calm of a man who has spent 40 years trusting his own internal compass more than he trusts any Studios.org chart. He has said the situation was what it was. He got to put the suit back on which mattered to him regardless of how the story ultimately got told around it. What he has said in the plainest terms when asked to make sense of the whole arc. The yes in 1989. The no in 1994. The quiet years. Birdman. The Vulture. The brief return. And the second ending is that it has always been the same process applied consistently for 4 decades. Read the script. Find the actual person hiding inside the character, not the role description. Locate the cheese. The thing this specific man wakes up needing every single morning that he cannot admit to anyone. Sometimes, not even himself. Figure out what he wears because the clothes tell you who he is faster than any amount of research can, and then commit completely or don't do it at all. He walked away from Batman in 1994 because the man inside that script wasn't worth finding. He says at 74 that he would make the identical call tomorrow in the same flat Pittsburgh voice he has always used for the decisions that mattered most with no theater in it whatsoever. Some choices look from the outside like they cost a person everything. From the inside, they are usually just confirmation of who that person already was. Michael Keaton turned down one of the most lucrative franchises in Hollywood history because the script wasn't good enough. And 30 years later, he stood in front of a room and said his nephew's name out loud because the trophy was never the point. He has never performed being Michael Keaton for anyone's benefit. He has only ever stubbornly, simply been him.